This lecture, we're going to look at sin and salvation according to Islam. And in many respects, Islam is fundamentally different from Christianity. First, according to Islam, it does have an account of Adam and Eve eating the forbidden fruit. However, Surah 6, verse 164 says, "No person earns any sin except against himself only. And no bearer of burdens shall bear the burden of anybody else." In other words, officially, Islam rejects the doctrine of the fall of mankind and the doctrine of original sin. They say, for example, Yahya Emmerich, I've quoted him before, a Muslim here from the West who's written a book to explain Islam, says, "Islam flatly rejects any notion of original sin and says we're all born pure. Yes, Adam and Eve sinned, the Quran says, but God forgave them, and when they asked for his mercy, no sin was passed on to their descendants." And so Islam says that everyone is born in a state of purity, or what the Arabic word being fitra, and that continues on until puberty. So what accounts for sin? Well, they're not too sure, but one Islamic source says, well, sin is the result of external influences and intruding factors. Or Emmerich says, we're merely forgetful of what life is about, and Satan uses our desire for pleasure to accentuate this. Well, what about morality in Islam? In Islam, good and evil, morality and immorality, are not based on universal standards of right and wrong, grounded in the nature and character of God himself and written on the human heart, which is what Christianity teaches. Instead, according to Islam, it is the specific commandments and prohibitions in the Quran and the Hadith, which together make up the shari'ah law, that determine whether something is moral or immoral, good or bad. And so, one Islamic scholar says that Allah ordained his law for you and his commandments to obey him. If you believe and obey and abstain from all the things he forbids you, you'll obtain what he's promised. And therefore, another Islamic scholar says, the observance of the rules of the Quran and the Hadith are compulsory for preservation of the soul from the fire and for its continued progress. Now, one aspect of this is you're not to question what is in there. You see, the Sharia is designed to be a comprehensive set of do's and don'ts that apply to all areas of life. You're not to question, because that leads to what's called innovation, or the Islamic word being bid'ah. And so Islamic morality is designed, the law, Sharia, is designed to provide a ruling on any issue that arises. Now, of course, because the Quran and the Hadith are based solely on Muhammad's word, Muhammad is at the center. It's the standard by which behavior is to be measured. So as one writer puts it, morality does not determine the prophet's actions, but his actions determine and define morality. That's one reason why we looked at the difference between Jesus and Muhammad in earlier lectures. Now, as I say, the Sharia law is designed to be a detailed set of do's and don'ts, good and evil, relationships among people that cover everything. Now, under Islamic law, all actions are either halal, which means allowed, or haram, which means prohibited. But the greatest sin in Islam is something called shirk. Shirk is associating partners with Allah. Related to that is unbelief, or kufr. Now, there are different degrees or levels of shirk, and then there's something called hidden. I mean, technically there's major shirk and minor shirk, but the problem is There's no list that defines which is major, which is minor. Some reference books have over 50 major ones, some less than that. It really doesn't matter because shirk can be very subtle. Any shirk will send you to hell, but hidden shirk is the most dangerous kind because Muhammad said it's more hidden than the track of a black ant on a black stone in a dark night. And so the examples are just amazing. I mean, the fact is, you don't know whether you are committing it, you see. This is why all Muslims, if they understand their own religion, are living in fear, because they may have committed hidden shirk and they didn't even know it. For example, one hadith says, whoever swears by anything other than Allah has committed disbelief or shirk. So one example of Islamic scholar says, if you say, if it hadn't been for this little dog or the duck in the house, the thief would have entered, you've committed shirk. Why? Because you said the dog barking was responsible for the thief running away. No, you should only say, if it hadn't been for Allah, the thief would have entered. But because of this, you see, the list of laws in the shari'ah is almost endless. And so all of these things, you'll be judged at the judgment. And yet, according to Emmerich, he says, when our good deeds and our bad deeds are about to be examined, Muhammad said that our prayers will be looked at first. If they are found to be full of deficiencies, then God won't even look at the rest of your life. He says, imagine going to court, having all the evidence that exonerates you declared inadmissible because of serious procedural errors on your part. You see, their whole life is so regulated. You mess up in one thing. For example, in the salat, the ritualized prayers 5 times a day, they have to be said in Arabic. If they're not in Arabic, they don't count. And finally, unintentional acts may not only be sin, but may be shirk. In one case, there is an Islamic writer says that you didn't even intend it. But one Muslim had said that, he saw another Muslim and who had done something terrible and said, Allah would never forgive such a person. Thereupon Allah said, who is he who says that I wouldn't grant pardon? I have granted pardon to him and blotted out his misdeeds, but you I condemn. And the Islamic scholar says, the man who made this statement had been a faithful worshipper, but his one statement, actually, and it was a statement designed to uphold the majesty of Allah, his one statement destroyed his life in this world and the hereafter. In this hadith, it is described that a man sometimes utters a sentence unintentionally, but the consequences of it are grave. So, that's sin, according to Islam. Well, but it's more complicated than that, because contrary to its official doctrine, Islam actually accepts the innate sinfulness of mankind. In Surah 16, it says, if Allah were to punish men according to what they deserve, he would not leave a single living creature on the earth. And then I note that human sinfulness is attributed to different things inconsistently in the Quran. On the one hand, human sinfulness is attributed to the way Allah made people from the beginning. So the Quran says man was created weak. Man was created very impatient and very violent and so on. And in the Hadith, it says that it was Allah who breathed into the human soul its sin. And in fact, Muhammad said in another Hadith, Allah fixed the very portion of adultery which a man will indulge in. Therefore, there will be no escape from it. So that's the way Allah created us. But another line of Islamic thought attributes human sinfulness to Adam and Eve's sin, which affected all of us. In other words, that it accepts the doctrine of the fall and of the doctrine of original sin. And so, in Surah 2, verses 35 and 36, Allah says, "O Adam, dwell with your wife in the garden, and eat of the things, whatever you want, but not from this one tree. But then Satan made them slip from the garden, and to get out of the state of felicity in which they had been in. And so we," Allah said, "get down, everybody, with enmity between yourself. On earth will be your dwelling place, and your means of livelihood for a time." So, in other words, that's the doctrine of the fall and original sin. And this is confirmed. Note that in verse 36 of Surah 2, it said, all people, not just Adam and Eve, were to get out of the garden. They were condemned to the earth for a time, which an Islamic commentator points out that that means limited life. So in other words, human death is attributable to what happened by Adam and Eve in the garden. So, and then in the hadith it confirms this. One hadith says, people will come up to Adam and say, "O Father, open for us paradise." And he will say, "What turned you out from paradise," or God will say, "What turned you out from paradise was the sin of your father, Adam." And so again, that is the doctrine of original sin. So Islam is inconsistent. On the one hand, they deny it. On the other hand, they admit it. Thirdly, in another line of Islamic thought, in the Quran and the Hadith, human sinfulness is attributable directly to the working of Allah. And so, in the Quran, it says, in Surah 16, verse 93, Allah misleads whom He wills and guides whom He wills. In fact, in the Quran, Surah 7, Satan says to Allah, "You made me go astray, and therefore I will try to seduce your people from going on the right path." But it's more than that, because in Surah 43, it says that Allah actually attaches demons to people as intimate companions, and it says, "If anyone withdraws himself from remembrance of Allah, we appoint for him an evil one to be an intimate companion to him. Such evil ones really hinder them from the path, even though they think they're being guided aright." So in other words, Allah is attaching demons, making sure people go astray. So what is it? Was it people are just responsible for their own actions? Or is their sin attributable to how Allah created us? Is it attributable to what happened in the garden? Or is it Allah directly causing people to sin? Islam says all of these things. Well, what about salvation according to Islam? Well, just as Islam is inconsistent regarding the nature of humanity and the cause of sin, it is likewise inconsistent regarding how people are saved. There are at least three different and inconsistent views within Islam. Number one, most Muslims believe that you're saved by balancing your good deeds against your bad deeds. But there's another stream of thought, and again, this is all in the Quran and the Hadith, and it's all in your book here. There's another stream of thought that says you're saved by Allah simply choosing, "I'll forgive you, I'm not going to forgive you." And third, the third way of salvation has nothing to do with your good deeds or Allah deciding, "I'll choose you and not you," but it has to do with Allah's pre-decree, whereby He eternally predestined people while before they were even created, to heaven or hell. So, let's take a look at these. First, salvation is a balancing of one's works. And so in Surah 2, verse 281, it says, "You need to fear the day when you'll be brought back to Allah. Then every soul shall be paid what it earned, and none shall be dealt with unjustly." And there's a number of other verses. And I think most Muslims believe that it's the weighing of your good deeds and bad deeds. In the last lecture, we saw how no one can earn your salvation by doing good deeds or bad deeds, and we gave you 5 reasons why that is true. I think you need to understand those reasons when you're talking with Muslims, because most Muslims believe that their salvation is earned by doing good deeds, and we saw how you can't do that for various reasons. But it's not quite as simple as weighing good deeds and bad deeds, because on the Day of Judgment, according to the Quran, everybody is going to go to hell first, and then only some, and they'll be tormented by demons, and then only some people will get out of hell. So we all know, at least according to Islam, you're all destined for hell. But even then, it's not enough. You're in hell, but then there's a narrow bridge, only the width of a razor blade, called the sirat, between hell and paradise. Everyone has to walk over that sirat, and at the same time, demons will have hooks and try and pull you off. I mean, who makes up this stuff, you know? But even then, that's not the end. A hadith says, when you get to if you're able to pass over the sirat out of hell, you'll be stopped on a bridge between hell and paradise, where everybody there is going to start fighting each other and retaliating. You did this to me, and somehow that's going to purify you. Who could come up with this? I mean, this is all in the Quran and the Hadith. I don't make this stuff up. Who could come up with these things but a madman? I mean, this is just insanity. But that's what happens according to if you can earn your own salvation. Now, the second way, salvation, is Allah's simply choosing to forgive some and not forgive others. And so, in the Hadith, Muhammad said, none among you will get to paradise by virtue of his deeds alone. They said, Allah's messenger, not even you? He said, not even me, but only that Allah should wrap me in his grace and mercy. But the problem is, according to Islam, none of that, if Allah chooses to forgive, that doesn't cancel out the effects of my sin. It doesn't change my sinful heart. And it doesn't uphold his justice, because Islam has no comprehension of the costliness of sin. It has no doctrine like Christ's upholding God's law by paying the punishment for our sin on the cross. According to Islam, well, God may just say, I forgive you, I don't forgive you, but his law is not upheld. Secondly, forgiveness is neither automatic nor guaranteed. In the Quran, there are a number of verses which I quote that say, well, perhaps Allah will give mercy. He forgives whom he wills, he punishes whom he wills. But you look at the inconsistencies within Islam. In the Hadith, there's one example that says, there's one guy who killed another. And it says, Allah laughs at two men, one whom killed the other, and then they both entered paradise. In other words, you're a murderer? That's okay, come on in. You're an innocent victim? That's okay, it doesn't matter. On the other hand, another hadith says, if anyone who is sexually defiled leaves a spot equal to the breadth of a hair without washing, then such and such an amount of hellfire will have to be suffered for it. So are we to conclude from this that an unwashed spot no wider than the width of a hair is more serious to Allah than murder? Well, maybe. You see, who knows what Allah will do. But there's a third way, and that is Allah's pre-decree, because it says that if Allah wished, this is Surah 4, verse 88, if Allah wished, he could have made you all one people, but he leaves straying to whom he pleases and guides whom he pleases. And in Surah 7, verse 179, it says, many are the jinns and men we have made for hell. And he says in Surah 32, I will fill hell with jinns and men together. So he created some for hell from the very beginning. Now, this is important. And what I'm saying, what I'm going to read to you now, is something that I can guarantee you no African Muslim has probably read. But it is in a collection of the Hadith called the Mishkat. Okay? It's not one of the 6 main versions, but it's well known and accepted. And again, The bibliography, all of these things are online. The bibliography is in the unabridged version of this book. And I suggest that you copy this because I, give the citation. Why? Because in this hadith, it talks about Allah created people for paradise. He created it for them when they were still in their father's loins. He created some people for hell, and he created them for hell when they were still in their father's loins. But the Mishkat has this hadith that says, Muhammad said, Allah created Adam when he created him. Then he stroked his right shoulder and took out a white race as if they were seeds. And he stroked his left shoulder and took out a black race as if they were coals. Then he said to those on his right, towards paradise, and I don't care. And he said to those who were on his left, towards the fire, and I don't care. What's that saying? He's saying, for all of you who are Africans, you were all created for hell simply because you're Africans, and Allah doesn't care. There's nothing you can do about it. That's why I say no African Muslim knows about this. And I quote in the footnote other hadiths that point out Muhammad himself owned and sold a number of Africans as slaves because they're just property to him. He even in another hadith mocked how Africans look. He talked about if your ruler is an Ethiopian slave whose head looks like a raisin. So in other words, think about this. This is not me. I'm sorry to have to say this to you, but this is Muhammad speaking. He was mocking how Africans look. He owned and sold Africans as slaves, and he basically said, all you Africans have been created for hell from the very beginning. How can anyone, especially an African, become a member of a religion that says that? This is beyond belief. I think this is very powerful. If you have this and show this to people, this is not me saying this. This is Muhammad himself in the hadith. Okay? But furthermore, remember we saw Islamic official doctrine says that all people are born in a state of purity or fitra until puberty. Well, but that's not true either. That's what most Muslims believe. But again, you go to the hadith. A young child, younger than puberty, had died, and Muhammad was invited to go and attend the funeral service. And Muhammad's wife, Aisha, said, "Oh, Allah's messenger, there is happiness for this child, who is a bird from the birds of paradise. For it committed no sin, nor has it reached the age when one can commit sin." But Muhammad said, "Oh, Aisha, it may be otherwise, because God created for paradise those who are fit for it while they were yet in their father's loins, and he created for hell those who are going to hell. He created them for hell when they were yet in their father's loins." So there is no assurance of salvation, even for young children. And finally, this leads to the issue, what about intercession? Well, the Quran says that there will be no intercessors on the day of judgment. And yet again, that's inconsistent, because in the hadith, Muhammad says, "I will be the chief intercessor." So what is it? The fact of the matter is that there is no assurance of salvation, as we have seen, and Muhammad himself said he had no assurance of his salvation. In Surah 46, verse 9, he said, "I don't know what's going to happen to me or to you after I die." And furthermore, he had been asked, he said, and it's in the hadith, he tried to intercede for his mother. Allah said, "You can't intercede for your mother." His daughter asked him for assurance of salvation. He said, "I can't do anything about that." Somebody said, "Oh, Messenger of Allah, where is my father?" And Muhammad said, in hell. But then he turned and said, and so is mine. So if Muhammad can't intercede for his own father, his own mother, his own beloved daughter, what makes you think he's going to intercede for you? He's not, and he can't. Because he admitted that, I don't know what's going to happen to me. You can ask a Muslim, you're going to trust your eternal destiny to someone himself, as we saw in a previous lecture, had to repent 100 times a day, who had no assurance of his salvation. You're trusting your eternal destiny to this? A man, you may recall, when we looked at the satanic verses, who couldn't tell the difference between the words of Satan and the words of God, when in fact, according to the Quran, there is one and only one person who is pure and holy, who is in heaven now, who is interceding for us, and that's Jesus Christ, who did for us what we could never do for ourselves. I mean, I think these things are powerful and can be very persuasive. If you learn them well and you explain them in a loving, truthful, winsome way, and if you show them, this is, make it clear, this is not me that is saying this. This comes from the Quran itself. This is in the Hadith. These are the very words of Muhammad himself. And then you contrast that. But these are the words of Jesus. Come to me, all you who are burdened and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. It's the difference between night and day. So that's a brief look at sin and salvation according to Islam. In the next lecture, I'm going to briefly look at implications of sin and salvation according to Islam, and then wrap up with a comparison between sin and salvation according to Christianity and Islam.